I want to say thank you to Ben for bringing me as close as I can come to being Tom Cruise. Because when he told me to talk in half an hour about the Orthodox Church and give you a presentation, I thought this is mission impossible. So thank you so much. We should have had the theme from Mission Impossible introduce me as well. Exactly. But and the other thing I want to say very quickly is that, to make another film reference, is that whenever I often think of the Orthodox Church, and whenever I meet brothers and sisters and friends who are not members of the Orthodox Church, what would be a good image to, maybe not the best, but maybe useful, to talk about the Orthodox Church? And I think, if you think of Harry Potter, if you think of the room of requirement, the room of requirement was where you found everything that you possibly needed or wanted, and many things that people had forgotten that they existed. But they were very useful when you needed them. So I think the Orthodox Church is a little bit like the room of requirement in some sense. Good. Now, what I want to talk to you about today, I want to talk about three things as I say something about the Orthodox Church. I think I want to give you a very brief history. I want to give you a sense of a faith outlook, like what gives Orthodoxy its why. What is Orthodoxy? What does that mean to be Orthodox? What's the content of the faith, in a sense, without going very dogmatic and catechetic on you. And then maybe talk about issues facing the Orthodox today, and a little bit about the Orthodox Church presence in the UK. But as you will have seen on the very first slide, I put journeying with the Orthodox Church is and the ES in brackets, because that's a bit, to talk about the Orthodox Church is, to us, sounds denominational. And the Orthodox Church feels that it is one church in many sort of local manifestations. So it's a little bit unnatural for us to talk about Orthodox churches as if they are separate entities. So, but we do live in this reality where you have different incarnations, and often there are different kind of flavors and approaches to what it means to be Orthodox by different Orthodox churches. So we have to live with these two things at the same time. Now, I want to start by giving you a bit of a quote from Metropolitan Callistos Ware, the late Metropolitan Callistos Ware, or Dioclea. He died in 2022. He was, you might have heard of him, some of you might have met him. He was in Oxford all his life, lecturing there as a university lecturer, and one of the greatest Orthodox minds and of the 20th century, I would say, certainly in the English-speaking world. So he says this in his very good book, The Orthodox Church, classic. Never went down to print, I think since the 60s when he published it, and you found it in different editions. It says Orthodoxy is not just a kind of Roman Catholicism without the Pope, but something quite distinct from any religious system in the West. The Orthodox Church is a family of self-governing churches. It is held together not by a centralized organization, not by a single prelate wielding absolute power over the whole body, but by the double bond of unity in the faith and communion in the sacraments. The Orthodox theology of the Church is above all a theology of communion. I've started with this quote because it takes a lot of good boxes to understand it in a snapshot what I think the Orthodox Church is to a degree, but also because of what he says here, that the Orthodox Church is above all a theology of communion. Maybe we'll get a chance to talk this in the conversation, and I'll touch a bit on this at the very end of my presentation. But I think today, speaking from within the Orthodox Church, I think one of the greatest threats that we face is this threat to the theology of communion, and how we, within this commonwealth of churches, so-called churches, let's put it this way, we struggle to maintain communion. One of the best examples is that there's a schism between the Patriarch of Moscow and the Patriarch of Constantinople. You might have heard about this because of what's happening here in Ukraine. And this sort of schism means that there is no, you cannot receive communion, which is completely, if you belong to one of these patriarchates, you cannot serve together, you cannot receive communion, as clergy certainly you can't. And that is a real threat to this theology of communion. Now, quick history as a snapshot, and then I'll go into a few things which might be a bit more funny, but at least light-hearted, because we have to take a light-hearted approach to some of these things at some point. So we have this kind of three generic stages of how Christendom sort of fragmented. We have the 5th and the 6th century sort of split between kind of Eastern and what we call Eastern and Oriental Orthodox churches, or the Chalcedonian, non-Chalcedonian churches, and that stems from the Council of Chalcedon in 451. Then you have the Rome split with Constantinople in 1054, and then you have the sort of 16th century Reformation. And these are kind of very broad strokes, kind of the stages of Christianity moving outward in a fragmented way. And in the East, to be more specific, certainly within the kind of Eastern Orthodox, not necessarily Oriental Orthodox, but in the East you have the apostles to the Slavs, the Saint Cyril and Methodius at the end of the 9th century. Then you have the Christianization of the Kiev and Rus, almost at the turn of the millennium. The fall of Constantinople in 1453, and the 19th century formation of European nation states. For the Eastern Orthodox Church, these are all very important, just landmarks, because on the one hand they point to developments and a sense of growth, but also to the end of an era, like the fall of Constantinople, and also the beginning of an era, which is also the end of an era, at the 19th century, when you have all of the nation states appearing, and then you have all of these national churches, hence the Romanian, the Bulgarian, the Serbian, the Russian Orthodox Church, these ethnic labels put in front of the Orthodox Church. I was saying the other day in a different place that maybe we should learn to change our language, certainly the Orthodox, and actually start saying the Orthodox Church in Romania, the Orthodox Church in Bulgaria. That would actually be a bit closer to the truth a bit theologically, but also I think it would not, as I said, not in a condescending basis, but not promote a sense of a denominational or fragmented reality to what the Orthodox Church is when you put the ethnic label. I'm going to show you a few charts now. So, with a reason. So, branches of Christianity, this is if you Google stuff, this is what comes up, you know. I've done some deep research. Very spent hours on it. But normally you see this kind of thing. You say the early Christian church, and then you have all of these Nestorian churches, and Oriental Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox, Roman Catholic, and whatnot. The Orthodox don't like this. We think that this is a wrong way of presenting things. Okay. What we like is on the next slide, or what we like, and kind of the Orthodox mind operates, is this other graphic. A timeline of church history, not because it's kind of sepia and it's old, it looks parchment-y. But if you look, there's a whole line, it says the one Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. And on it you have, again, it's a different date that emphasize different moments in the history of the church. And then a little further down it says the Orthodox Church, that way. And then you have kind of, almost like on a motorway, you have kind of something that kind of exits, and we're not really interested, they kind of just go into something's happening over there, but it's not our business to a degree. Now, as I said, it's a bit funny, but it's important to understand kind of, even on small things, a difference of perspective. Because the Orthodox will call themselves the one true church. And this is often a difficult hurdle in ecumenical dialogue. But it's there, and it's something that we have to deal with. I might say something about that maybe in the Q&A or later if I don't outrun my time. Now, if we move on to the next slide, I just want to give you a snapshot of kind of the churches that form this Orthodox Commonwealth. And that's a picture there from the 2016 Pan-Orthodox Council in Crete, or the Holy and Great Council in Crete. It was really the first time that the Orthodox came together after many years in a sort of, not like an ecumenical council, but as close as there could have been. It wasn't, very good hopes for that council. In practice, it didn't turn out as the people hoped. Moscow Patriarchate wasn't present, Bulgarian Patriarchate wasn't present, so a few important churches, because of numbers in history, were not present. But that's a picture there. And look, remember the hats. Now, if you click again, sorry, and then you see that there's 4 ancient Orthodox patriarchates: Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, Jerusalem. Then you have 16 Orthodox separate churches. Just click away, Laura, thank you.
Okay.
So you kind of populate, okay? You can take the slide and knock yourselves out with all of those. I'm not going to feel you. But again, and then if you click again on the next slide, again, you'll see that besides the autocephalous, self-heading, self-ruling, you have autonomous churches that are kind of running themselves but under the authority of another kind of one of the major patriarchates. Obviously, you have the situation in Ukraine where there used to be 2, then there were 3, and now they're back 2 kind of Orthodox churches, one under the Moscow Patriarchate and one under the Ukrainian kind of national church, the state, and so on. But overall, there are about 260, 300 million Orthodox worldwide. Now, if you, the next slide will give you, if you thought that was confusing, it will give you very easy to follow charts about what the Orthodox churches are and how they are kind of, you know, so we can quickly move on from that. And now if you want to see the next slide, this is what I call the Orthodox tube map. Looks like one of those. Okay. Now, I'm being slightly facetious here, but the reason why I put all of these here is because I think this is how, I mean, you can correct me, but I think this is how other Christians perceive us. These guys are kind of a spaghetti stuff. And I hope I'm wrong, but I don't think I am. But that's part of the reality that we as Orthodox, I think, internally have to deal with, and we have to take that seriously. Because we like, as I said, to think of ourselves as, oh, that we're all one family, we're all one church. But in reality, we're very much fragmented. And then the kind of the flavor of Orthodox, the flavor of the Orthodox that you might meet in your parish or area or church might differ, and they might give you, and I set the whole sort of benchmark for you about what it means. Oh yes, and the other one, this is the best, sorry. This is like the next one. No, this is like, I can't even understand that. But again, you find these things and people try to explain how things are connected and related and how they moved from the Russian tradition, what churches came out from the Greek Byzantine tradition, you know, all of these other things. Fine. Now, if we move on to the next slide, it gets a bit more interesting and serious. So the Eastern Orthodox in worldwide context. If you click again, sorry, another bit of information. So this is interesting because at the Pew Research Center, Pew 4, you might have heard of it, obviously. But they do wonderful research about all religious denominations, Christian traditions, and world context. And they found out that 57% of people living in the region of Central and Eastern Europe identify as Orthodox. So it's a good chunk, 60% almost of the population. So it's a large majorities in countries like Romania, Greece, Ukraine, Russia, they identify as Orthodox. What that means is that Orthodoxy, by and large, seems to be concentrated in Europe. And Orthodox Christians have declined as a percentage of the global population. The chart there kind of maps that thing. It says, you know, as the world population grew, the Orthodox population didn't follow that trend. So, you know, in terms of real numbers, there's been a decline. And now today, just 12% of Christians around the world are Orthodox, compared with an estimated 20% a century ago. Okay. But I think for me the most interesting bit of information is that nearly 4 in 5 Orthodox Christians, so 77%, live in Europe. So in a sense, that makes Orthodoxy, to a degree, a very Eurocentric kind of faith, although there are large and growing, let's say, Orthodox communities in the States, in Australia, South America, and so on, but they don't really make a dent compared to the numbers that are still present in Europe. So that's a good contrast with other Christian traditions you see, where you see a lot more growth outside of Europe. So Europe, to a degree, in terms of secularization and other things, it becomes the exception and quite a particular context, and then you have to look outside. Again, this is good for context and for understanding who we are. The next slide gives you a sort of a map to understand by intensity where kind of concentration is. But as you can see, the Orthodox are kind of spread all over the world. although in some places they're sort of 0.1% or something. But kind of the northern hemisphere seems to be where things are more present. The other slide again gives you a very colorful, for your own sort of delectation, your own spare time, a kind of a map of the canonical, as it were, territories, and that's a whole kettle of fish, and it's a can of you know words. Sorry, of I call it the Douglas crystals. About overlapping jurisdiction, how many bishops do we have in a particular area. That's a whole conversation in the Orthodox Church, which we haven't sorted. That again eats into the whole communion aspect of Orthodoxy internally. Now, if we move on to the next slide, you'll see that there's also an Oriental Orthodox Commonwealth. That's, again, different hats. That's important. So this is a picture from the May meeting in this year of the Oriental Orthodox churches in the Middle East, celebrating 17th centuries since the Council of Nicaea. So it's wonderful to see that. You see the Orthodox do come together in part of their own tradition and ecumenically and so on. And these are kind of the member churches of this Oriental Orthodox family of churches. Very sort of ancient churches like the Armenian, for example, Syriac, obviously the Coptic, and so on. And they're spread mainly in the Middle East and Africa and a little bit in basically India. That's our Orthodox Church. If you click the next slide, you'll see the distribution, kind of with the Oriental Orthodox Christians in the world. And again, it's very clear that there's a few in France, maybe a few in Finland, Sweden. And then again, sort of North and East Africa, Middle East, and India. Right? But they're sort of large minorities, not kind of the main religious sort of church of family. But there are about 6 to 70 million Oriental Orthodox worldwide. Now, I want to spend a few minutes looking at the Eastern Oriental Orthodox dialogue, because ecumenically, this is important. The closest family, these are the two closest family of churches, and it's important to understand why there isn't a full communion between the Oriental and the Eastern, when all of them use the label Orthodox. This very label, the names Eastern and Oriental Orthodox churches, is a convention that really came up as part of the dialogue in the 20th century. And if you are interested in this, anything written by this wonderful lady, Christine Chaillot, about the Oriental and Orthodox churches and the dialogue is worth reading. It's not boring at all. There's a joint commission for the theological dialogue between the Orthodox churches and the Oriental Orthodox churches, and they've had meetings since 1964. The first ones were non-official, as it were, non-sanctioned by their governing churches, but more like theologians meeting and stuff. But then you had a bunch of these meetings, official meetings, in Geneva, Egypt, again Geneva, Switzerland seems like a good place for this. And then you have, there was a huge break between 1993 and 2005. I don't know why exactly. Maybe some people died, some people retired, and they just dropped the ball. But then in 2005 we had another meeting of representatives. Now, the next slide explains why we have this dialogue and where the problems stem. And this is so, without being too granular about this, this is so indicative of how the Orthodox think. You know, issues that go back all the way to the 451 Council. You know, like, oh, are they still talking about that? I mean, we didn't have running water there or something. You're like, I don't know. So it's important. But the problem between the Orthodox Eastern and Oriental is a Christological debate. You know, kind of the formula of Chalcedon saying that Christ is one person in two natures, divine and human, without confusion, change, division, or separation. Essential theological stuff. And the Christology of the Oriental Orthodox is based on a formula by St. Cyril of Alexandria, who is a common saint for both Eastern and Oriental Orthodox. In Greek, he says basically, the translation is that he talks about the one thesis of God's word incarnate. And then they say, well, are you talking, is this monophysitism, you know, like one nature, are you confusing things? Anyway, complicated theological stuff. Not the place to run into this now, but into detail. But the problem is that, I mean, the good thing is that all of these meetings that have taken place between the Orthodox and the Eastern and the Oriental Orthodox have actually realized that they were sharing the same theology about Christ. They're just using different words. So if you go on the next slide, the most recent kind of official joint statement from 1993 says that in light of all the unofficial consultations and the 3 official meetings that had taken place by then, we have understood that both families have loyally maintained the authentic Orthodox Christological doctrine and the unbroken continuity of the apostolic tradition, though they may have used Christological terms in different ways. So they realize it's a problem of kind of vocabulary or semantics rather than theology. And then, even in 93, they proposed the lifting of anathemas. Basically, these are the next steps that we need to do for restoring communion. And nothing happened. So this is for me a huge kind of problem and puzzle. And then if you click on the next slide, you'll just see a picture from last year, September, a year more or less to the date, where they had that's the most recent Eastern Oriental Orthodox Dialogue meeting taking place in Egypt in the monastery center we showed. And this is very hopeful. But to have again another break from 1993 more or less to 2024 for something that is basically resolved, it's a problem. That speaks to the speed of ecumenical dialogue and in the Orthodox Church, in a sense. We can come back to this. But this is something that we should all keep in mind. Now, let's move on to the faith outlook a little bit. So, I mean, if I were to give you a snapshot of kind of the things that when you think of the Orthodox Church or when you identify the Orthodox Church, you recognize it by this focus on the sacraments, on the Eucharist, the Divine Liturgy, the Creed, fasting. In Orthodoxy, Easter is just a little bit more important than Christmas, if we can talk about that like that. But Easter is the feast for the Orthodox. And then monasticism is still very important, and it guides a lot of the spiritual life of lay people, of churches and parishes. And there's a strong connection between parish life and monastic life in most Orthodox countries. And icons, obviously. Now, I want to, without going into a lot of detail, the next slide, I think I want to emphasize the point that Orthodoxy is really useful to be understood almost like a different timeline. Like if you imagine again all of these Marvel films where they've done a bunch of films and they ran out of story, so they introduce a different timeline, like this would have happened, this is what would have happened, and the whole universe develops. But the Orthodox is like a different timeline, a little bit from the Christianity of the West that we kind of all know about. And there are different patterns of historical becoming, specific type of social, cultural, and religious conditioning that happened in Central and Eastern Europe and the Middle East. I mean, there's delayed modernity. I mean, we had the Ottoman and Russian empires that only fell kind of 100 and a bit years ago. That's a damper on things. And there's delayed modernity on account of religious differences. A good little book, if you want to read more about this, is Stephen Ransom's The Orthodox Churches and the Secular State. It is a collection of his lectures that he gave. And I think one of the first articles in there, or lectures, really gives you a snapshot about the differences that he sees them. And I think he's kind of right, almost to a fault, about the differences. If we go to the next slide, I'll just read a little bit from these longer quotes, but it's important to understand. He says, in the West, when we speak of the church, we usually mean the ecclesiastical organization. To the Easterner, the church always means the whole body of the faithful, the Holy Catholic Church of the Creed, or at least the faithful of his own persuasion. And then he says, kind of, in the West, because Rome fell, and the church was kind of the only place of continuity and strength, as it were, from the old order, says, it took a different role than it did in the East. And then it became more of an organization than in the East. It says it lifestyle decisions, clear-cut decisions in matters of faith. It stood for unity and precision, and so on. But in the East, the world continued after the fall of Rome. And basically, the clergy didn't have to take a special role; they were just part of the construct. And although they performed the mysteries, and although the ordination gave them a specific grace, it did not set them entirely apart from their flocks. And again, the emperor was a symbol of unity in the East. And then you had a bit more democracy again in the East, because you had 4 patriarchates. You only had Rome in the West. So there was a bit more balance. And again, the basic attitude of the Orthodox was doctrine was, and is apophatic or negative. So there's a little bit more stuff that we cannot say. There's a little more room, as it were, to move in a way that maybe in the West wasn't developed anyway. Again, if we move on to the next slide, he says, to the Orthodox, many doctrines are better left to mystery. And that sounds very imprecise. He says, this imprecision gives the Orthodox believer an elasticity in his belief, which the Westerner, with his liking for precision and certainty, finds hard to understand and suspects of lacking integrity. And then he says, the relationship between church and state in Byzantium were undefined and imprecise. Church and state were considered to be integrated. You know, the patriarch ranked next to the emperor, and to a certain extent could control the emperor. So I really wanted to give you this kind of snapshot from Ransom of kind of the Orthodox mind and so on, and a sense of historic development different from the West. And I'll just choose maybe 4, I think, of these things that I listed in terms of identifying the Orthodox. So on this slide with the sacraments, the Orthodox profess sort of 7 sacraments: baptism, chrismation or confirmation, Eucharist, confessional penance, matrimony, unction of the sick, and priesthood. And I'll try to give you quotes and I'll just read the quotes without going into further detail, because I think they offer you a good snapshot to understand the perspective of the Orthodox about these things. Alexander Schmemann, a great 20th century theologian, American, Russian, says, in the Orthodox ecclesial experience and tradition, a sacrament is understood primarily as a revelation of the genuine nature of creation, of the world, which, however much it has fallen as this world, will remain God's world, awaiting salvation, redemption, healing, and transfiguration in a new earth and a new heaven. In other words, in the Orthodox experience, a sacrament is primarily a revelation of the sacramentality of creation itself. For the world was created and given to man for conversion of creaturely life into participation in divine life. So for the Orthodox, sacraments are not symbols, they are something that speaks to the fundamental reality of creation as God's creation and God's presence in creation. And this idea that the creation is always pulled towards unity with God and sort of being viewed by the Spirit. And Stanislav, the Romanian theologian, has been declared saint now in Romania. He says the mysteries are the means through which the union of human beings with Christ is brought about. So it's not at a symbolic level, it's at a very kind of real level. The Eucharist. The Orthodox believe in the real presence in the Eucharist. And that's a big thing, and that creates continuity from the earliest period of the Church. Schmemann again says, the purpose of the Eucharist lies not in the change of the bread and wine, but in the partaking of Christ. This is why the gifts themselves never become in the Orthodox an object of special reverence, contemplation, and adoration, and likewise an object of special theological problematics. How, when, in what manner the change is accomplished. So this kind of scholastic questions about when does it happen? How does it happen? When is it become? So the idea is that there is this is the apophatic side of things. And St. Gregory of Nyssa, all the way back to the 4th century, he talks about the Eucharist as sort of God, Christ spreading himself to every believer by means of that flesh. So there's real partaking of him in his fleshly reality as well as God and man. And he says, through these things, he bestows the power of the blessing which transforms the nature of visible things to that of the immortal. So both the elements, but also the person partaking, is transformed basically from something tangible, visible, to something that's immortal. The Divine Liturgy. The Divine Liturgy basically is an image of the kingdom of God, an image of the last times, says Metropolitan Joseph Zoulas. He basically what he says is that if you attend an Orthodox liturgy, you really experience some of that perspective. It says, there is nothing so clear as this in the Orthodox liturgy. Our liturgy begins with the invocation of the kingdom. The liturgy always starts with the great blessings, it's called. It says, blessed is the kingdom of the Father, and of the Son, and the Holy Spirit, now and ever, and unto the ages of ages. Amen. So every time you start the liturgy, you are in the kingdom. It's there. You're participating in it. And this, the second quote from Saint Sophrony of Essex, is brilliant, because it highlights another thing that's important about the liturgy to consider. It says, the divine liturgy occurred one time forever. It has eternality. He wasn't a native speaker in English. But he says, every time the divine liturgy is celebrated, we rise up to its height. We follow the divine liturgy because we do not live it, or until we live it. The divine liturgy teaches us to live with the heart. So the liturgy is an action of Christ, as you can see in that icon, but it's also something that is done whenever we do it on earth. We're not really repeating something, we're just entering into the liturgy of Christ, that is eternal sacrifice. And icons. I've only got two more slides, I think, and that's it. I think I'll stick to time. Icons. I love this icon, this Coptic icon of Saint Mimas and Christ, where Christ comes in like this. You can see his hand over there. Christ has a very long light. Anyway, but I love this quote from a Spontaneity Bloom in one of his sermons on the Sunday of Orthodoxy, which is the first Sunday in Lent, when the Orthodox celebrate icons, basically, the victory of icons over those who deny the icons. Possibility of depicting sort of God, the saints, and so on, Christ. He says, we do not possess any likeness of Christ, and we are not trying to reproduce his earthly features as accurately as possible. So icons are not sort of, they're not aimed to do that sort of photographic, photorealistic type of thing. An icon painter displays in an icon the knowledge of the Church of God, about the Word of God incarnate in human features. What is to be conveyed to us in lines and colors, basically, is the vision of the divine presence in human features. So how a person has been transformed by their connection with Christ and by the indwelling of the Holy Spirit. And says an icon is then blessed, is hallowed, it becomes within the Church a real focus of presence. That's so important. Icons are not just pictures. Whenever an Orthodox faces an icon, they feel that they're in the presence of Christ in a different way than if you're just in nature or, admiring the sunset or things like that. This is why we bow to them and so on. And he said, icons speak of the incredible closeness of God, who unites himself to man and makes history his own, but also unites himself to the very matter of this world, for it to become pervaded with divine presence, to be filled with it. It is a message of great hope, and not only about men, but about all things around us. So again, icons are not just a question about church aesthetics or a particular kind of theology. What he says here is, icons are a message about our world. And if you take the theology of icons and kind of put it over, the ecological crisis, the crisis of identity today, where we feel like, we're just dealing with the world and God is somewhere miles away. The icons actually argue the opposite. Now, issues facing the Orthodox today. One could talk in a whole presentation of 5 hours just about these things. So challenges, a few of them. Obviously, there's still the communist legacy as a challenge for the Orthodox, because a lot of the Orthodox countries were under this communist sort of iron curtain. And that's manifested in state-church relations. There's still a dependency between church to the state, even today. There's an issue of religious illiteracy, even if you have 86% of Romanians saying, for example, that they are Orthodox. But I don't know how many of them can recite the creed in its entirety or without mistakes. That's one example. There have also been divisions because of the communist legacy. See Ukraine. Another challenge is obviously modernity, with pluralism, secularization, migration, the formation of these deep diaspora as so-called communities, which brings jurisdictional frictions, and also it brings the reality that insularity is no longer an option. Okay, so now Orthodox share the same modernity in the West as everybody else. You cannot say, oh, we have our own modernity story and we're bound by it. No, we're here as well. How do you reconcile, how do you put these things together? That's a big thing. Obviously, I have no nationalistic meta-narratives, Romanian, you have to be Romanian to be Orthodox, you have to be Greek to be Orthodox, and all of these things. This idea of believing in belonging, which is about nominalism, I think this is one of the great plagues of Orthodoxy. And then the rendering of sobornost, the kind of the sacred canopy of meaning, as I said, about community, communion, and so on. I think we're fighting this now, this embracing unity of the Orthodox theology of communion. But opportunities, well, only 3 on my list, but migration and diaspora is one of these opportunities. Pluralism is an opportunity. Life in ecumenical dialogue is an opportunity, which often are found, as it were, in the West. That's something to maybe talk about. The Orthodox in the UK today. We don't know how many Orthodox there are. Between 475 and 3 million. Maybe John could help me with this. But again, nominally, if you think how many Romanian, Russian, Greek nationals, let's say Bulgarian, Serbians are in the UK, maybe about 3 million if you put them all together. I think the last Romanian census, in a sense, after the EU referendum, was about 1.2 million Romanians registered for settled status or pre-settled status. Okay, nobody knew that there were so many. They are a plague. Everywhere. No, but and then if you think, oh wow, all of a sudden we only thought they were about, I don't know, 500,000 or something. So you have this big number presence, but in churches you don't see that necessarily. I think you have the same ratio in, let's say, the UK as you might see in Romania or Russia. You see only about 10% or 15% actually go to church or are active. So you see that replicated here as well. I don't take this as gospel, but at the Institute we try to do a bit of research about the number of parishes and the demographics of the Orthodox presence in the UK. This is a project that we might actually revisit and develop, maybe as part of a collaboration with the CT, because I think it's important. Because there are no real numbers, we don't really know. But apparently for the Eastern Orthodox, there are about, we see 346 parishes across the UK. For the Oriental Orthodox, maybe about 135 parishes with different concentrations around London, the major cities in the UK and so on. Now, the last picture is this picture, which is a very hopeful picture, I think. The first ever gathering of Christian bishops in the UK took place earlier this month at the Institute. There's a beautiful room at Jesus College next door to us because they do nice dinners and theology on an empty stomach. No, but this was wonderful. It was a very fraternal meeting, and it was historical because it was really the first time that you had representatives from all of the Orthodox churches coming together and saying, we do want to work together, we do want to collaborate, we are brothers, there are differences that we have, but what really unites us, I think, is more than what separates us, which is this cliche in a sense, but it really is true and works. So, in terms of the Orthodox in the UK, I'm very hopeful. I hope that this will be a first meeting of many, not just at the Institute, let's say, which has this kind of maybe an educational aspect to it, but a further sort of strengthening of the Orthodox commonwealth across the Eastern and the Oriental divide, as it still is, but it didn't feel like a divide at this meeting. So people were really hoping to work closer together and to meet. So I want to leave us with this because it's very hopeful, I think.